All right, folks, hello and welcome. Welcome to Free Together, Free Apart, Hacking Family Success. When I was fiddling around with the name for this show, I said, oh, I like this Hacking Family Success. But then I thought, oh, it's kind of trendy, but I still like it. And I'll tell you why. It's because what is hacking? You know, hacking is when you use an innovative technology to solve a problem more rapidly and more fully and more effectively than what was done before. You know, and it's got this kind of a little bit subversive tone to it. And I think that's exactly what Murray Bowen, you know, his work has provided for many of us. You know, in some ways we're a small community, but an influential community, tend to be influential within our networks, within our own families. And we know there's something really precious there. We know that that fundamental science that he developed of looking at the family as a system and the principles that he derived from that study and the tools that came out of it, you know, they become fascinating for some of us and a guiding principle for the work that we do, which is aligned with the mission here at the Vermont Center for Family Studies, strengthening families, strengthening communities. So I'm still with this title, Hacking Family Success. So welcome. And, you know, today, this whole project, this conference and the meeting we're having today to preview it is a big experimental leap for me. Eric Thompson, I'm the executive director of the Vermont Center for Family Studies. I think I know all of you. It's a big experimental leap for me. And it's really exciting. And what I think is that, you know, it's probably something that all the clergy members of the Bowen theory community know so deeply already, that there is technology within the spiritual traditions, these meditation traditions, that is very aligned with strengthening the family as a system. And that there may be more overlap and more opportunity for us to develop new ways to hack differentiation of self or non-anxious presence than I have been using, you know, or than I have been seeing, or maybe that our community has been seeing, that the Bowen theory itself has been seeing. Bowen invented new things. I think we should keep going, keep inventing new things, or finding new things that work. So I would like to, I thought this morning, this meeting is kind of like a rehearsal dinner. So, you know, what's a wedding? A wedding is a cross-discipline event. You have the grandparents, they have one discipline. You have the parents have another discipline. The romantic couple, they have a discipline, the siblings, and they all come together. And it's a very fertile opportunity. And, you know, we have a long tradition in the Bowen theory community of these multidisciplinary conversations. As those of you who have been in the community for a long time know, that the Bowen theory community has been very disciplined staying in contact with biology, systems biology, and evolutionary theory. And so we're used to these cross-discipline conversations. And years ago, there was a priest who knew a professor at Georgetown who was really into integrating Catholicism and evolution. And he created a whole bunch of meetings he called them Wisdom of the Ages. Some of you may have gone to some of those, like I did. And this is kind of an iteration of that same sort of thing, this conference. And so at the rehearsal dinner, we have a number of our presenters here who I'm going to introduce now, and then we'll just start chatting over hors d'oeuvres. The meal is later. It's October 7th and 8th, the feast. So let me start by introducing our two, sort of external guests from the Bowen community, our guest scientists. And first I'll introduce Dr. Fred Travis, who has been at the 3 previous iterations of this conference. So he's part of this conversation, and Dr. Travis is learning about Bowen theory, and we're having fertile interactions about that, and I'm learning more about his research. Just last night I was reading a paper that he wrote about theories of consciousness and the idea that the science of consciousness is moving beyond a classical view and more to a modern, you could say, quantum mechanical view, and maybe even beyond that. So Dr. Travis is a neuroscientist who's published 80 plus papers in peer-reviewed journals. So he's a real scientist who also has a foot in something very, very cutting edge, which is meditation and the study of inner silence and the study of transcendence, the neuroscience of transcendence. Welcome, Fred.
Great to be here. Thank you for the rehearsal dinner. It's a great idea.
Fred is also the center, he's the director of a center, a research group at Maharishi International University in Fairfield, Iowa. It's a center for cognition. Tell me, Fred.
Brain, consciousness, and cognition.
Brain, consciousness, and cognition. So, and Fred, I asked Fred, who would be a wonderful person to have join us in this multidisciplinary dialogue? And I was also telling him about Dr. Bowen's interest in ESP, which he just sort of touches on in some of his writing. But, ESP is really fascinating. If something like precognition exists, and if it exists more commonly in families, that may be telling us something really fundamental about the nature of the family system. So Fred said, I think you should talk to Arno Delorme, Dr. Arno Delorme, who's with us also today. Hey, Arno.
Hello.
Arno was born, I believe you grew up in Paris.
That's right.
So we are all jealous of the city he grew up in. And Dr. Delorme is like Fred, he's a very serious scientist. He's got a brain mapping software that is being used all over the world by researchers. So he's I think, Arno, are you an inventor? Am I correct?
Well,
inventor?
Yeah, if you want, sure.
Okay, I will. And he's a professor at UCSD, a prestigious institution. But he has a side thing, it's not even a side thing, it's just another thing that is very experimental, very cutting edge. As one of the in-house researchers at the Institute for Noetic Sciences, which was founded by the astronaut Edgar Mitchell after he had an extraordinary experience that changed his life, changed his view of life on his way back from the moon. So this institute is been going on for a long time and has a great tradition of sponsoring research like Dr. Delorme's on things like ESP, contact with deceased ancestors, trying to explore these things scientifically. And even beyond, you'll hear when we get chatting with Arno, he's thinking about all these topics like what is consciousness and what is the research on psi. Tell us about the nature of consciousness. Welcome, Arno.
Thank you.
So great to have you here. And okay, now I'm going to introduce our two other Bowen theory scholars who are here with us, Suzanne Brew and Leslie Fox. So many of you know these two figures from the Bowen Theory Network. Suzanne Brew was one of the founding members of the Vermont Center for Family Studies. She published a book on type and exercise, actually, a very wonderful book, very insightful book. She's got a 30-year journey with Bowen Theory, very disciplined person who's been on it the whole time. I think knows the theory well, has applied it, practiced it, taught it. And Suzanne also has a fascination with Jewish mysticism, an increasing fascination, and she's been on a mission for the last 3 years to understand that better. And at the conference, she's going to give us a talk on meditation, Jewish mysticism, and Bowen theory. Welcome, Suzanne. You're on mute right now, and so are you, Leslie. I'll tee you up.
Thank you, Eric.
Welcome.
It's good to be here. Thank you.
Leslie Fox is an entrepreneur. She started a company in her 20s, led it for decades, sold it, very successful businesswoman. And, you know, kind of like all our speakers here, she had the very grounded, you know, practical side. And then on the other side, she integrated adventurous ideas, Bowen theory, into her business leadership. And she wrote a book on that, Leading a Business in Anxious Times, very well-written book. And she's on the faculty of the Center for Family Consultation in Chicago. Welcome, Leslie.
Thank you.
And Leslie and Suzanne are also on a journey with me where we're basically studying the effect of transcendental meditation on non-anxious presence. Not by studying it from a book, but actually doing it, living it. All right, it took me 12 minutes to introduce you guys. Maybe I want to start with a big sort of out there question for Fred and Arno, which is, you know, we've been chatting a bit here leading up to this about this question I have, you know, what do the science of consciousness, neuroscience of consciousness, modern ESPA research, what do you think they might have to contribute to our understanding of the family as a system? What might they, I'm just going to leave it like that and see if, but you got any thoughts on that, Arno or Fred?
My first thought is it's giving a different unit to understand organization. Psychology usually looks at the unit as an individual person.
Right.
And I see what ESP research is doing is saying, no, we live in a larger system, and the unit is not the person, but the unit is a system. And I think that is consonant with what Bowen saw, is that the family is the unit. That's what you have to take into consideration. Yes, there's individuals within the family, but it's the family dynamics, which is determining individual expression affecting family units. So I see that one implication.
Is that a parallel to the idea that a particle of light, a photon, is a fluctuation of a galactic field? What do you think, Fred? Is that
It's reasonable analogy. You need to think through what is the application of it. Because in that case, the photon is not considered, yes, it's a particle wave nature, but more fundamentally, it's considered a ripple within the unified field. So it's actually a specific mode of operation of the whole. And so we'll have to think for the individual, is the individual family member simply a mode of operation of the family field itself? And what that's taking away from is the fact that the individual, I think, is also connected to a larger field, which itself contains a family field. I mean, we have the family, you have the community, we have the community, we have the nation, and so on. And that's all part of a larger field of interconnected functioning awareness. And this is fundamentally, I think, what's driving things. But it's being reflected at different levels. And one is the individual thought and action and preference. I'm going to go into Bowen family. I'm going to go into Rogerian therapy. I'm going to be a scientist. I'm going to be an artist. But it's also reflected in families. How does a family as a whole grow together? And how, once you realize that you're part of that larger system, how do you grow? But it brings to mind Bronfenbrenner's bioecological model development, where he began to see these increasingly larger layers of interactions which are influencing the individual. I think what Bowen family is doing, his theory is doing, is articulating what is that first larger system within which we live.
Yeah. Some of the scholars at University of Vermont here where I live are into this Bronfenbrenner. I haven't met them. Arno, welcome to the wedding feast. What do you want to put in here?
Yeah. First, I want to say, this is a passionate, topic for me. My mom is a psychiatrist and psychoanalyst, so I've been, in the family, not the family theory, but systemic family. She had me read, some books about that when I was young, and so it's a very interesting topic for me. And our research on psi is linked to the hypothesis that everything is connected. And also the degree of connection is probably linked to the degree in emotional connection we might have with other people, especially our family. So we are running experiment, for example, to see if psi runs in families. So we have experiments where we run psi experiments. So it's basically we test people telepathic connection and using rigorous double-blind experiments, and then we assess whether this tends to be more robust within families compared to outside of families. And within families, we also have a gradient. We have, like, for example, we have this experiment where we check identical twins, whether homozygotes or heterozygotes, which means they have different levels of genetic overlap, or with parents you have 50% of genetic overlaps, or with brothers or people who are not genetically related to you. So yeah, I think there's this very strong link between potentially psi, if it exists, and we believe it does based on the experiment we do, and family.
This term psi is probably unfamiliar to a lot of people in the Bowen network. Arno, what is it?
So psi is a term that regroups basically what so-called paranormal phenomena, and not all paranormal phenomena, only the ones which are mediated through the mind, because there might be others. And so it's a fringe topic in science and psychology and neuroscience, and I can't claim it's been demonstrated that it exists. There are studies that shows like strong indication that this is real and this is worth studying, and that's what we're doing. But obviously it's very hard to study in a standard academic setting. So I don't study that at UCSD. I study that at the Institute of Noetic Sciences. So psi is, for example, telepathy is psi. Mediumship, people who claim they can contact with deceased individual, is also considered psi. Whether they actually contact with this individual, so for example past family members, or whether they use telepathic connection with their clients. And then you also have telekinesis, so moving an object at distance. So we're also studying these questions, and some effects seems to be more robust than others. For example, telepathy seems to be more robust than telekinesis in all the experiments we do. And we try to run them in double blind, so nobody knows what happens, and we analyze the data at the end. This way we're not biased. We also try to do what's called pre-registration. which outline everything we're going to do, and so we can't change our mind later. So we're using the actually the field of psi research, or parapsychology as you call it, has been leading in terms of a methodology, because people are so skeptical. You want to use the best tool possible to try to convince the scientific community at large. So that's what psi is basically.
Yeah, I think for many people, just this simple idea that there could be something like precognition or telepathy they'd be extremely skeptical and feel, any science related to that was full of hoaxes. But
Yeah.
yet I think it's also interesting that if you talk to individuals, including scientists, and I know your colleague Dean Radin has done careful studies of this, that lots of individual scientists believe in this, because they had, like one friend of mine in the Bowen Network told me about an experience they had where they were quite sure they knew something was going to happen, and then it did happen.
Yeah, and so there is
can't prove that, but they knew it. They felt a great sense of knowing about it.
Yeah, so there's the individual experiences, and a lot of us have had, at least once in their life. I think we did some polling, and about half of the people have had at least once in their life. They're convinced, that they had this kind of experience. And then there's also, in the scientific community, this impasse that, okay, how does consciousness emerge from inert matter? Nobody has a clue. People do hand waving. Oh, this is that. But there's a fundamental problem here of inert matter giving rise to consciousness. It's ontological, and everybody acknowledged the problem. It's called the hard problem of consciousness in neuroscience. So philosophers have acknowledged it. There's no solution to it. So it's kind of a impasse. And then this psi research and the type of consciousness research we do, and Freud does as well, is saying, well, consciousness is a fundamental property of nature. And so we try to, that's our working hypothesis, and then we try to make experiment that demonstrates this. So consciousness can interact possibly with other consciousness without the intermediary of matter. It's a fundamental property of consciousness, and it's also linked to our emotional connection with other people, etc. So that's where like family theory might come in.
Leslie Fox, what are you thinking as you listen to Arnold talk about these expansive possibilities and concepts? And you're muted too. By the way, Leslie's taken on the task of talking to us about modern physics and Bowen theory at the conference.
Yes, of which I know like this tiny little bit. I got fascinated by it along this journey that we've been on for a number of years, and there's just so much there that has sparked my curiosity. But I think this whole notion of how does consciousness emerge, where does it come from, and what is quantum, and what is quantum physics and theory and all of that, it's so challenging because it's so outside of our experience as using the scientific method. You can't see everything. There's no microscope or telescope that lets you see everything, and a lot of the proof of it is in abstract thinking and more in mathematics, of which I'm not that well versed. But it's left me realizing that I had such a narrow view of science. It was all in what I learned in biology, frankly, and I studied a lot of that in college, and just dabbled a little bit in physics. But this has really been just so it just broadens your whole sense of being part of the universe, of that there's so much out there that we don't know. There's whole sciences that we have not yet had the capacity to visualize or to experience. And that's what makes this all so exciting. I mean, it's you learn every single book I pick up on this subject. I can't say I understand a lot of it, but I always learn something. And it's like putting together one of these gigantic puzzles, these awful puzzles that I don't do, but there's so many pieces. They keep getting bigger and bigger. And yet it still seems to come down to this notion of some kind of universal connectedness. I think that's a very powerful concept that has really resonated for me in these last few years. So it's just been a joy to go down this path with all of you, Brad and Eric and Suzanne.
Yeah, thank you, Leslie. So, and I'm going to do as I normally do. I'm going to bring Suzanne Brew into this in a moment, and we'll talk for a little bit more. And we have about a half an hour left in this rehearsal dinner, and then I'm going to give you an opportunity, some of you, to have a breakout experience where you talk a little with each other about what these ideas have stimulated in you. And by the way, that's very much in the structure of this 2-day conference. That another thing I'm experimenting with is how to create a very powerfully interactive and meaningful dialogue on a Zoom meeting at a conference. And I've been very careful about this. I have a very defined structure on how I'm going to try to do that this year, iterating upon my effort to do it last year. One person told me last year, who was at the conference, she said, it really did feel like one big conversation. And I was very pleased to hear that. So I also want to mention just something on what you said, Leslie, that so in the Bowen theory, we focus a lot and have talked a lot and analyzed the difference between individual thinking and systems thinking. And it's viewed as a fundamentally different way of thinking, systems thinking. And what I think is that the science of consciousness, these modern theories of consciousness, similarly require us to embrace a different way of thinking. And there's a lot of potential benefit for Bowen theory in it. Because I think it is a systems view. And I'll just say one thing I've been thinking just this week. Do many of us have a cutoff with our deceased ancestors because we have a limited view of the nature of the family system? And that maybe beyond going to visit where they were and learning the facts about them, there could be a richer emotional connection between us and deceased ancestors that could be very beneficial to the family, and promoting of non-anxious presence. This idea is in a lot of ancient traditions, and maybe Suzanne Brew can tell us a bit about how it lives in Judaism. And one of the other guests at our conference will be Ernie Pomelo, who's a very successful entrepreneur, but he just has a long relationship with near-death experiences. And I'll be interviewing him about this possibility of bridging the cutoff between people who are deceased. And I think differentiation is also relevant for that. I just heard recently that the founder of TM recommended that when people die, there should be a period of mourning and then a period of celebration. And that this celebration was extremely important for the soul who's passed to be let go. And that resonated with differentiation in my mind. So I'm kind of playing with this, contact with deceased ancestors and Bowen theory, the concept of Bowen theory, cutoff and differentiation. Suzanne Brew.
I'm just thinking about a little bit about deceased ancestors in Judaism. I mean, there is that period of about a year after a person dies, when you put you have the unveiling, what's called the unveiling, where there's the tombstone is put up. There are all sorts of reasons for that. Probably the one that seems to be the kind of making the most, Judaism has so many reasons for everything, but what I think makes the most resonance is that there's that period of, when they enter the next realm, that there's that, they need a year for that period before entering the next realm, which is one of the reasons. So
kind of like a transition or a freshman year.
Yeah, maybe freshman year in college.
How does the mother function
like
during the freshman year in college?
There you go.
Has an impact on the functioning of the student at college.
Yeah. But there is a gathering around the tomb afterwards. We hope that doesn't, that's the thinking about moms in freshman year. Great.
What do you think of this idea of kind of clinging to the deceased person versus freeing them with celebration?
Yeah, no, that's why there's that year, that you have that year where there's more dedication, more celebration of their life at that point, as opposed to when you're mourning, immediately afterwards. So, but I've been thinking, and I'm pretty fascinated at this point in my life with Jewish mysticism, and Jewish mysticism, as all mystic traditions, are trying to kind of bridge the gap between the human and the divine. So whether it's oh boy, I think I've just lost. Can you see me okay?
I can still hear you. It's okay. Just keep talking. We lost your video, but we can still hear you.
Okay. So I'm really been pretty fascinated actually with Jewish mysticism and what it has to do with other mystic traditions. And the Zohar, well, Kabbalah really, which is probably the foundation of Jewish mysticism, really came about in the 13th century, which I found really interesting, because most people think it came about in the 1st or 2nd century, but it was really in France and Spain then. One of the things that I think what was fundamental too is that it's not, you needed to, it's reimagining God and reimagining the relationship that people have with God, that you're now having more of a direct relationship with God, as opposed to any restrictions that the Hebrew Bible put on what you should and shouldn't be doing, all the rules in the Hebrew Bible in the Old Testament. So I think that's where the mystics wanted something different. But I wanted to mention something else, which is that I thought was
is that getting beyond the book?
Yes, exactly. Getting beyond the book is yes. The book is just
book is beautiful, but it's different than the living experience. Similarly to, you can't really learn Bowen theory unless you engage it in your family.
Yes.
You can't really understand meditation unless you practice it.
Absolutely. And one of the other things that this is just, I'm going to just segue, because there's something that I was reading in the last few days that really reminded me of Bowen theory, that was written in the Zohar. And it was about one of the psychological dimensions of the Zohar, that compassion, they really defined, that separated love from compassion, and that in favor of compassion, and said, and I think Danny Matt's translation of the Zohar is just amazing. But he was saying, if we just love a person without considering of what that person can receive, love can be destructive because it can smother that other person. Love that is given boundaries, definition, and some means of conveying love that doesn't overwhelm the recipient. So I thought that was like, wow, that just, written in the 13th century, and it's feels straight out of Bowen.
I want to share with Arno and Fred too, this So this is she's pointing to a relationship between Judaism and Bowen theory there. And I'm curious, Arno, if there's any data that strikes you related to this in your understanding of the psi research, that in Bowen theory, this idea of connectedness that you referred to earlier, that you're working to quantify, I think, and measure connectedness and its impact on things like telepathy, if I follow you. In Bowen theory, there's the idea that connectedness can be excessive, that it can be a kind of attachment, a clinging attachment, and that we call it undifferentiation, is a fundamental property of the family system, differentiation being a fundamental variable in family systems. And that this kind of excessive attachment, or you could call it anxious attachment, is the root of a lot of symptoms for humans. Actually, Bowen, I think, suggested that ESP might show up more in what we call emotionally fused relationships, which I think might be wrong. So anyways, any thoughts about that, Arno? Or questions? You could ask a question.
Yeah, or I mean, first, I'm not going to give an answer. I'm just going to give my opinion because I don't think
Sure.
we have an answer these days. And our hypothesis, consciousness permeates everything, is very much rooted in a lot of the, ancestral spiritual traditions, including the Kabbalah, and so I personally don't make a strong statement that this is more Buddhism or this is more Christian, mysticism or the Kabbalah. I personally believe these are just different paths, the same top of the mountain, and so that's how you get there. In terms of strong attachment.
Excuse me one second. Just apologies. For some reason, there's a lot of background static.
Yeah, it might be my. Let me change my Zoom settings.
It wasn't there before.
Yeah. Surprise here. How is it now? Is it better?
It's about the same. Yeah.
If I go on mute, you stop hearing it, or?
Yes, it stopped.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I can plug in my external microphone. Just give me a second, and then you can.
While he's plugging in, Fred, what are you thinking about?
And the specific question again is?
Well, that's a good question, Fred. Well, Suzanne just shared this quote about this kind of what you could call anxious emotional connectedness. Mm-hmm. It's one of the contributions of Bowen theory. In many psychotherapeutic models, connectedness is considered to be almost like a holy grail. You could never have too much. And that many times is sort of, we would consider a knee-jerk assumption is that they don't have enough connectedness, and that's what the problem is, say in a marriage that's struggling. Whereas in Bowen theory, the idea is it may actually not be a lack of connectedness. It may be a kind of immature connectedness that stimulates excessive reactivity to each other, whereby they're not independent, or as you have written, their sense of self is not what's the phrase you use? Embedded in objects of experience. Okay. It's not de-embedded from the other person, and therefore their sense of self is riding on what the other one does or doesn't do. Interesting for those of you in the audience who don't know Fred's work, he's written and done studies on this quality of the sense of self being de-embedded from objects of experience, which I find tremendously resonant with differentiation of self. So yeah, that's an interesting feature of Bowen theory, that resonates with this idea of embeddedness. That's what I was asking Arno about.
Yeah, thank you for clarifying. And what you brought up is just my perception is, what are you connected to? You know, if you're connected to that part of you that is whole and is putting together all of your thoughts and is able to hold space for difference in the family and to embrace it, then that's a good connection. Obviously, if you're connected to something which is changing, and then when that which changes, and then your sense of self, your stability of emotions and so on. And so it's a matter of what you're connected to. I think Bowen had that sense because he has the idea of differentiation of self. He knows that, yes, the self is not a static point, but the self is a gradient which is growing. And as it grows, that dynamism is changing all of the values, its interactions with everyone in the family.
That's very interesting, the idea that maybe differentiation has to do with being connected to the most fundamental, unchanging values in the other, rather than something like, you know, I just don't know what I'd do if my kid moved out of my house because I'm attached to talking to them every evening. It makes me feel better.
Yeah.
Thank you. Hi, Arno.
So is it better now?
Yes, you fixed it.
Yeah.
You fixed it. Yeah.
Yeah. From my perspective and the research we do, anything that so you know, in the mystical traditions, you know, you kind of have this thing in common, which is like dissolution of the ego and lack of attachment to worldly things. And in our research, this is linked to possibly better psi connection because you're unhindered by, you know, everything that goes up in your mind and your attachment with other people and your attachment to things. Your mind is free to receive from it's usually not, you know, like it's not in your environment. It's more, you know, in the spiritual and mental realm. So it's more receptive to psi effect and, you know, things which are very subtle, because you don't have these strong thoughts that grab you here or grab you there, you know, and keep you from accessing these very subtle variation that, you know, would underlie psi.
Have you studied that?
We've studied that with some experienced meditators. So people who are very advanced in meditation, and these are more anecdotal reports. In general, people were higher on so in psychology, we have what we call the Transcendent Scale. People were higher in the Transcendent Scale, do better at the psi task. But also, you know, like everything in psychology, it's never 100% clear cut. You know, it's sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't work. So it's just a trend over lots of studies and meta-analysis. But, you know, this seems to be the case that people were more spiritual, in quotes, you know, tend to do better at psi task. And our hypothesis is because they're less attached to, you know, other thoughts, etc., that would distract them and keep them on accessing that information. And then some people are just naturally talented. You know, we do believe also there's a, you know, potential genetic components that also runs in family, which is why we're running these genetic studies.
Just to reflect on that, if I could, we're currently looking at a large group, 75 people with a range of transcendental experiences from nil to consistent throughout day and night. And we're using the psi task, I don't know, that Dean Radin has created on the internet, where you have the gray, a gray form, and you visualize what will come up, and then you have some image in your mind, and then you select, does it have parallel lines, curved lines, nature, and so on. And our main question is just to address what you're bringing up, is the degree of experience of transcendental of the transcendent state linked to greater performance, more successful performance on that. And looking at the data, it hasn't come up. The people who have had the most successful, as in they got it each time, well, one, they were having very high levels of transcendental experiences, but also their whole family had been doing this, their mother, their grandmother. So you're trying to separate out DNA from transcendental experiences, I think is a real critical question. Is psi something that grows with more connection with a fundamental field of consciousness, or is psi an ability that you have and you can develop a relative ability, which may be independent, which may not be integrated at all? So next year, Arno and Eric, we might have some information on that.
I'm going to ask Arno at some point, and I don't think we're going to have time today, but to just tell us some stories, some interesting stories about telepathy or precognition. But I'm glad Arno put in quotes. He said spiritual, and he put in quotes. I used the word spiritual in the title of the conference for the first time this year, and it was a bit of a leap for me, and it forces us to try to define this term. What does it actually mean? So I will be sharing some thoughts about that. One of the reasons I put that word into the title this year was to extend an open hand of welcome to the clergy community, who have been very influential in Bowen theory. It's a large community that have been disciplined students of Bowen theory, and just to kind of, I want to welcome those voices in to this dialogue, the clergy community. And by the way, one other thing to mention is that one of the other members of the presenting group for this feast is a very long-term meditator named Mark Roberts, who I've become friends with, and who's very articulate about his, he's one of these people who just went all in for developing his relationship to the transcendental aspect of himself. So some people might say he's kind of like a monk, but I don't know if he'd relate to that term, but he's, Malcolm Gladwell said you need to have 10,000 hours of practice on anything in order to achieve mastery. Mark Roberts is probably up around 40, 50,000 for transcending, for experience inner silence. And he's somebody who's very articulate about these kinds of things, and I'm glad he'll be with us. So normally I go into a small group, but I'm thinking our group is the right size. I would like to just see if any of the members who are joining here would like to unmute and share some thoughts or ask a question. I'd love to hear from you. You can be skeptical or just say something that this discussion has gotten you thinking about. I really want to welcome that. Now just give a minute give you a minute to think to yourself, what has this gotten you thinking about? Jude, would you like to share?
Yes, I don't have much to share, except that it's been fascinating, and I'll see you at the conference. It's really added a dimension to my understanding of Bowen theory. So I started in an internship program here in Vancouver, BC, 10 years ago, and have been continuing with them and counseling as part of their mission statement to provide low-cost counseling to lower socioeconomic groups. And it has always seemed to me that there is more to be explored that is consistent with Bowen theory and also with more of who we are as human beings. So this has been fascinating, and thank you all for providing the preview.
Thank you, Jude. Anybody else who's got kind of in our group here. Rebecca Massini, Reverend Massini, what are you thinking about?
I was really thinking about your first question, Eric, about, how do we know the family? And and I don't know why I never heard that question the same way before, but there's so many different ways of knowing and understanding the family. And because I work with so many families, like on big life passages in their life, like births and baptisms and funerals, it's just really, I'm going to be doing some work on thinking about all the different ways we think about family and the ways of knowing family. So what supports more health and functioning of families and making deeper and richer experiences in life with greater knowing the family.
Arno, could you give us a little taste of this study of communication with deceased ancestors? I know Ernie Pommel is going to be fascinated to hear about it too.
Yeah, so we run several of these studies. In one of them, for example, so we have someone, so we recruit people, they want a reading about a deceased relative. And it's usually a deceased relative, so spouse, or grandfather or mother. Sometimes it's a friend. So, I mean, we didn't exclude friend necessarily. And so we recruit them on the internet. And then, so we have a researcher that knows their name. And then we go see a medium, which we've pre-selected. And the person who goes sees the medium just have the name. Somebody wants a reading about John. They want to connect with John. And so the researcher who arrives to interview the medium, and this is all done in the laboratory in California. And we have mediums coming from all the US actually, and from the East Coast, etc. And so they're in the lab and they said, someone wants a reading about John. So the person who asks knows nothing about John. So we don't have this problem with what's called cold reading, where the medium is going to, might be trying to fish for information,
right?
Because the person who asked the question knows nothing.
Right.
So that's one thing. But we also ask the family member to, okay, at this time of the day, you're going to have a reading. Okay, so try to focus on connecting with your deceased relative. And so then the researcher asks all these questions. So we have a series of questions. We have 25 questions, which the order changes every time. And it asks, for example, okay, what was so we let the medium focus for a minute. Usually they meditate for about a minute, trying to connect with the deceased relative. And then we ask them, okay, what was the color of their hair? What was their habits? How did they pass? What was their occupation? What was their personality traits? And then we also ask them, oh, can you give me a date or something? So we collect all these answers. And when we were doing that, we also recorded their brainwaves, by the way. And so they had to pause so we would get good data for their brainwaves. And, the experiment is more complex than, I'm just summarizing here. But then we have all these sets of answers. And then we send these back to the person that wanted the reading. And they rate, okay, yeah, this is correct. Yeah, they had blonde hair, or, they were tall, or, their occupation was this. And the problem is this is very subjective, because, if you really believe the medium was in contact, you're going to rate everything positively. And if you don't believe, you're going to rate everything negatively. I like to give that example. For example, the medium says, okay, John was an electrician and he was a plumber. So somebody that's very positive would say, oh, this is the kind of same trade, plumber, electrician. I'm going to rate this super high. Or something that's skeptical is going to say, this is completely different answers. I'm going to rate something very low. So what we do as well is we send these people a reading that wasn't meant for them, but we change the name. So the meeting was for somebody else. It was a real reading, but it was for Robert. So we changed the name from John to Robert, and we have them rate both reading, the reading that was for them and the reading that wasn't for them. And this way we can compare their answer, and we know if they were very positive, they're going to be very positive on them. And on this experiment, we found we found that the mediums, you know, were above chance expectation in terms of in statistical terms. So I made it very short. I'm sorry, you know, I had to condense.
It's a good example, Arno, of the rigor and the kind of processes that you're using to try to get beyond bias.
Yeah.
I'll just share that I happened to be present when two of my grandparents passed away. And with my grandmother, I've told this story to many close friends. I had a very striking experience that I wasn't expecting, because I had never actually been with a family member who passed away before. That never happened, but I was in the room with her when she was passed away, you know, with her body, just myself and her. And I just had what I can only describe as an unmistakable sense that she was watching me. And it lasted for 2 days. I tried to describe it to my wife. I said, what it feels like is if I close, you know how if you close your eyes and someone walks in the room, you know they're there? You can somehow sense that they're there, even though your eyes are closed. And if they leave the room, even if it was completely silent, you can sort of sense they're gone. I had the same feeling with my grandmother, which is not something I've had many times. And Ernie Parla has a very detailed journey of experiences like this. And one thing that's very interesting to me about him, and why I wanted to get him into our conversation, is that he lost his only daughter to cancer last year. And I've been able to watch his grieving process. And it's been striking to me how his background with these kinds of experiences has had him, you know, more differentiated in his grieving experience, and his experience of managing that extremely difficult and extraordinarily difficultly timed loss. She had just gotten married, and she found the cancer literally the day after she got married. An only daughter, so it's the grandchild that they never had. So we're coming to the end of our time. Leslie, would you like to say anything? I want to welcome a few more comments as we're closing out our time. You know, just before I do that, actually, let me share. Can you see my screen? Are you able to see my screen? Okay.
Yes,
so
we can.
You can see here that we're going to have another preview in 3 weeks, or 2 weeks, where we're just going to carry on this sort of a conversation. Leslie and Mark Roberts have agreed to interview me about the conference. I also want to note that Suzanne Brew and the Pomelo Real Estate Company have made this conference possible, and we're extremely grateful. It's things like that that allow us to keep the price very reasonable as we possibly can. We know that a lot of people who work with families, you know, aren't compensated really highly. So there's the conference poster. It's 10 to 4 the first day and 10 to 3 the second day, Thursday and Friday. Trying to make it a not overburdened Zoom day with some good breaks. We have a symposium coming up on December 3rd. I'll tell you more about that at the conference. We have done it every year for 25 years. And I want to thank the people who support us through donations online. It's very encouraging and helps us a lot. Also, that we have a professional training program. It's just about to start this year. This is kind of what it looks like. We're training family therapists, family advisors of all types. All right, I think we're at the end of our time. Thanks for joining us. I hope to see you again in a few weeks. Welcome to the conversation, and have a good day.